I'm Christian from Denmark. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm going to present some work we did some years ago, trying to understand sort of the anglers out there on a particular fishery, sea trout fishery in Denmark. And that's me catching a sea trout. I don't fish much, so it's a quite rare picture. I can tell I'm really a crappy fisherman, to be honest. But even blind hens find corns, we say in Denmark, I don't know. Anyway, so why does this matter? Why does it matter with these the sea trout? In Northern Europe, it's a quite important fishery, particularly in the Baltic area around here. And this is Denmark. So if you go into a plane and you fly north for about 14 hours, that's what you're going to see out of the window if you look down. So that's where we are in the world, and Denmark and others. So all this area here, you'll have sea trout, and it's a quite important fishery, recreational fisheries. As in many other fisheries, there are really challenges facing high mortality and so on and so forth. So we need some really good management, and we need to understand the people involved, as always, because what drives their satisfaction, their behavior, and everything. So that's what we set out to do in order to be better to do our management and understand this fishery and communicate with the people involved. The way we try to explore this is something called the recreational specialisation framework. It's been around for many, many years, and it's just one framework to characterize people who is doing recreational activities. There are others, but this is one that has been used several times. The original idea was Brian in 1977, and he said that there is sort of a succession from being a generalist when you're new in an activity to become a specialist way of doing this a lot. And today it's sort of, there's been a lot of research on this, and it's more thought of as a multi-complex, multi-dimensional construct that can capture this angular complexity by looking at the psychological commitment, the behavior. Welcome, Warren. We just started. Sorry, no worries. And the cognitive dimension as well. So here I'll come back to the details about this, but we explored two components here: the psychological commitment and skills, and behavioral commitment. And our overall hypothesis was that one of these dimensions, sub-dimensions, was a better predictor of behavior than the other one. So if we go into the specific objectives, Brian back in the days, he said that you can predict different things from this. And this is where this framework becomes interesting, is that if you can ask people some questions and get their answers, and from that predict what they're going to do or what their attitudes is, then you have some kind of a tool to give advice and so on. So that was what we were hoping to show somehow. And then we wanted to see if this PCS, the psychological commitment and skill, was a better predictor than the behavioral commitment. And from that we wanted to draw management implications for this coastal sea trout fisheries. So this is the study site. Back to Europe, you zoom in on Denmark and you zoom in on this little island, which has a perimeter of around 500 kilometers of coastal areas, and you can fish sea trout anywhere. So it's a diffuse fisheries. It's hard to sort of do surveys unless you go out and interview people, and that's what we did here. These are the interview sites, and we spent like 3 months, and that was Casper, the first author of this paper, who did this 10 years ago. And we got a fair number of interviews, and from that we sort of built this study. Actually, we didn't. When you interview people, you have like a certain amount of time. You cannot ask them like 20, 30 questions about the same thing, right? So you have constraints there. And we tried to do very limited set of items or questions. 4 questions about avidity. And then we did something new where we inspected the angler, the gear, and the clothing. And this interview guy, he knows quite a lot about sea trout angling, so he could say, you know, is this a guy who knows what he's doing? The gear, is it expensive? Is he specialized? So he made some kind of visual inspections that we wanted to test how that could work in this concept. And then we had one item about skills and one item about centrality, and we were pretty excited if that could work with so few items. Anyway, so what we did was that we run some of that. Those of you who were at the workshop Sunday knows all about this. I know more than I do when I entered the workshop, so thanks to that, for that, Gerard. But what we did is that we did actually a Varimax analysis, an exploratory factor analysis, because we had these two new items that we didn't know where to put. And then what it came out with was the gear and psychological commitment and perceived skill grouped together, and the B.Sc, which was the avidity, grouped together, and it was these measures of the reliability was okay. So we went with those. So now we have two different subdimensions that can explain something about behavior. And that's what we now test in our hypothesis. And I'll present you 5 hypotheses briefly. And the first one was that we would expect that tourists would be more specialized than the local anglers. The reason behind is that tourists that travels a long distance, they invest time, they invest money. It must be more important to them. They must have a more commitment to this fishery, and they should be more specialized. And that's actually what we saw. And I'm going to present all results like this. I'll present the results from this subdimension called the PCS, psychological commitment and skills, and then the behavioral commitment. And what we saw is that this is a conceptual figure showing that the locals is very low on PCS. Danish tourists, that's Danes that don't live on the island, but from outside the island, that travel to the island, and international tourists had the highest specialization. For the B.Sc, we saw a different pattern, which makes sense because the local have a better accessibility to this area, so they have the possibility to fish more, so they have a higher ability. So that was sort of what we would expect, so we can tick this off saying, okay, now we know something about the tourist and the residents. This is a German tourist in Denmark. And the saying is that tourists, not only do they steal our partners, they also, steal our fish because they harvest everything. But we also wanted to explore that in this context, so we wanted to look at catch retention orientation. Again, Brian would predict, or he predicted that the more specialized you get, the more you're willing to release your fish. You're more focused on the resource, it's more important to you, you release it for conservation actions, right? And we looked at this in 2 different ways. First, there was an online follow-up, I don't know if I mentioned that, but in that online follow-up, we asked people different things about their motivation for going fishing, and one of them is how important is it to catch a fish for consumption. And we related that to the PCS, and what this figure shows you is sort of the probability of scoring high, very important, is declining, and not at all important, is increasing the more specialized you get, right? So this is the specialization, high specialization, low specialization, very important to consume. It's not high here, but not important. It's maybe a little bit tricky, but trust me, high PCS, low importance of consumption. We also, so this is stated behavior. We also looked at revealed behavior because at the creel survey, we asked people if they caught a fish and if they had released the fish. And then we could relate, again, the PCS to that. And the higher PCS, the more was the propensity of releasing fish. So that matched perfectly what we expected. And here, the behavioral commitment had no effect. So it didn't predict anything. So it was that one that was the one that predicted. The third hypothesis is also a classical one that relates to gear. It says that fly fishermen have to invest, fly fishing and spin fishing, 2 different types of fishing. Fly fishers invest more time into learning this. It takes more time to master it, and that should be the specialized anglers compared to the spin fishing. And again, we saw that. Actually here the PCS, and again the relative spin, very low specialization, and fly very high. In between we have something called bombarda. And I won't go into too much details, but it's a floater with a line and a fly at the end. So it's a different types of fishing. It's spin fishing, but requires some skills still not to get entangled in this fly and everything. Trust me, I know what it feels like. Bringing it back, I'm not very good at fishing. So anyway, but you see this follows the expected pattern. And there was also a pattern within the behavioral commitment, but it was not that clear, so to speak. So that's what the results. The fourth is about trophy orientation. That's also a classical one. The more specialized you are, the bigger fish you want to catch. That's what satisfies you, is the big fish. And then we also tested another one, which was the expectations. Because we asked them, what would you expect to catch to be very, very happy on this fishing trip? We asked them at the interview, how big should a fish be for you to be happy when you leave this fishing trip? And that's the expectations. And what we found was that, yes, indeed, high PCS, they have higher size expectations, and high PCS have stronger motivation for trophy fish. Same type of figure as before. Trust me, that's what it shows. There was no effect of B.Sc. Okay, the fifth is about trip satisfaction. It's a very important thing to look at when you look at behavioral patterns and human dimension aspects in recreational fisheries. And I'm running out of time, so I just want to say that what we found here is something that was surprising. We didn't see any effect of PCS. We would expect, because they had high sort of catch expectation, they could have a lower satisfaction, right? They will rarely catch what they expected and have a lower satisfaction. We didn't see that, probably because the tourist that travels far away, it might be more complex than we thought. We saw an effect of B.Sc, but it was not really clear what drove it. But what this shows is that different catch rates, 0 catch rate per hour and 1.5 fish per hour, when you're not that committed behaviorally, you see huge increase. You get more and more happy for each fish you catch, whereas you do not see that here, right? It's a diminishing return, it's called. Yeah, maybe these that fish a lot, they have higher, they're just more happy. They just fish more, so their starting happiness or satisfaction was higher. Anyway, so what did we learn from this study? The PCS, very few items actually, a very simple set of questions with some visual inspections were able to predict several of the behaviors, gear choice, trophy orientation, expectations, consumption, and so on, whereas this behavioral commitment, and that aligns with many other studies, that avidity doesn't really say much about, does not have a high predictive power. It's about understanding the more psychological side of it. Right, so now we can address some conflict narratives. That tourists, they are not as harvest oriented as the locals think, so we can mitigate conflicts. And we can also learn that because there's a lot of fish released, that we can prioritize catch and release practices. And maybe something about communication, to communicate what could be expected on a trip here as a tourist, in order not to get disappointed tourists when they return home, right? Because they have high expectations. Yeah, I'll skip that one. So, thanks to those who paid for it, and thanks to all the participants in the survey. And this is a happy angler.